Anarchism is a political philosophy grounded in opposition to hierarchy and state authority, which has its origins in 19th century Europe, co-evolving with ideologies like Marxism. These kinds of radical politics were all coming up in the same circles, and while anarchism and communism aren't interchangeable terms, there's a very high degree of overlap. The self-strengthening movement in China, when you had this growing revolutionary republican sentiment, saw the groundwork laid for the rise of anarchism in China. I'm going to be focusing mainly on some Chinese anarchist thinkers, but I want to make it clear that anarchist influence in China went far beyond them. Just to give you an idea of how widespread it was, Wang Jingwei, the leader of Japan's Chinese puppet state, and Communist Party leader Mao Zedong were both influenced by anarchism, and Kuomintang founder Sun Yat-Sen likely was as well. Anarchism made its way into China primarily through Chinese citizens abroad, with two main Chinese anarchist groups forming in the cities of Tokyo and Paris. These two groups weren't entirely separate, with plenty of interaction between the members of both, but they had some clear distinctions in their ideological currents. Two major figures in the founding of the Tokyo group were husband and wife duo Liu Shipei and he-yin, who in 1903 joined the Anti-Qing Restoration Society, founded by Tsai Yuanpei. The Restoration Society's activities drew negative attention from the state, prompting Liu and he-yin to flee to Tokyo, where they met fellow Chinese radical Zhang Ji, who introduced them to anarchism. The Tokyo group would develop their own unique strain of anarchism, drawing heavily from Russian anarchists, but also looking back to classical Chinese sources like Lao Tzu to construct a vision of agrarian anarchism rooted deeply in Chinese culture. They listed their own goals as being to destroy national and racial boundaries to institute internationalism, resist all authority, overthrow all existing forms of government, institute communism, and to institute absolute equality of men and women. He-yin would write some very interesting anarcho-feminist works, which I don't have time to get into here, but if anyone wants to learn more, I'd recommend checking out this video by Zoe Baker, or its accompanying article linked in the description. The Tokyo group would implode after Liu and he-yin unexpectedly returned to China and began working with the Qing in 1909, and Liu would go on to support Yuan Shikai's bid for emperor. Zhang Ji would go on to work with the Paris group, following a very similar path to their members. The Paris group has its origins around the same time, when Wu Zihui fled from China after publishing an article criticizing the Qing and insulting the Empress Dowager. There he met with Li Shizeng, Zhang Renji, and Chu Minyi, and introduced them to his friend Tsai Yuanpei, who had come to Paris in 1905. In 1906, they formed the Anarchist New World Society, and would publish a newspaper translating anarchist works into Chinese, and hosting articles from many figures, including members of the Tokyo group, and the anarchist-influenced Republican Wang Jingwei. While they shared many values of the Tokyo group, they opposed any associations between anarchism and classical sources, wanting their ideals to represent a firm break with traditionalism, and instead drew exclusively from Western sources, at least in explicit terms. They would go on to join Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance, which would later become the GMD. The Paris group would be highly influential in Chinese history for decades to come. They would be the primary organizers of the work-study movement, which would bring many Chinese students to France in the following decades, including many who would go on to become important members of the CCP. Additionally, they were heavily involved in the Nationalist Party during the Civil War, with Wu, Li, Zhang, and Tsai becoming known as the Four Elders of the GMD. Even though they represented a far-left ideology, they supported the GMD's right-wing faction led by Chiang Kai-shek, as opposed to the left-wing faction under their longtime ally Wang Jingwei. Despite the clear contradictions between Chiang's hard-right nationalism and the Four Elders' anarchism, they remained firmly on his side throughout and after the Civil War. Only Chu Minyi would ally himself with the left-wing faction, and when Wang Jingwei allied himself with the Japanese, Chu would become a major pro-Japanese propagandist. It seems rather odd that in so many cases we would see anarchists and anarchist-influenced figures in China working with firmly authoritarian factions, including Liu with the Qing and Yuan Shikai, the Four Elders with Chiang Kai-shek, Wang Jingwei and Chu Minyi with the Japanese, and more tangentially Mao Zedong with his own turn to authoritarian socialism. How can we explain this contradiction? Well, counterintuitive as it may seem, we can actually see the basis for these actions within the anarchist ideologies developed by these groups. The Tokyo group's heavy grounding in classical sources gave them a certain conservative bent, with Liu concluding that even though all government was bad, autocracy was preferable to republicanism, hence his support for the Qing and later Yuan Shikai. Meanwhile, Wang Jingwei and Chu Minyi's collaboration with the Japanese was largely born out of the anarchist principle of anti-militarism. It's ironic considering how extremely militarist the Japanese were, but to them, rolling over to Japan was the best path to peace. Mao's authoritarian turn, meanwhile, was born in part out of the ineffectiveness of the Chinese anarchists. They were disorganized, and even those with sway in the GMD did little to push for their ideals, out of an opposition to using political power. While Mao shared many of the goals and even some of the means of the anarchists, therefore, he and many like him turned to the proven revolutionary strategy of the Bolsheviks, with their centralized party and use of the state. That just leaves us with the question of why most of the Paris group worked with Chiang Kai-shek, even as he seemingly took the GMD further away from anarchist principles than ever before. Well, to answer that one, we're going to need a bit more context than I can fit into this video. Later, I'll release a longer follow-up going more in-depth into the ideological currents undergirding the different Chinese anarchist groups, and how these explain their work with authoritarians. Subscribe if you want to see that, and I'll see you next time.